Jerry Langton is an investigative freelance writer and author who has worked on both sides of the Canadian border. One reason is the multi-billion-dollar drug trade industry intrigues him. Recently, he went head-to-head with some of the criminals, cops, and narcs who crossed the Mexican border. He writes about his experiences in a book called Gangland, The Rise of the Mexican Drug Cartels from El Paso to Vancouver. It is my pleasure to welcome Jerry Langton to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Thanks for having me on.
Nice to see you. Both sides of the Mexican border. What's going on?
What's going on is basically a civil war in everything but name. Drug trafficking has been concentrated in Mexico for decades now. And in 2006, the government decided to crack down. It hasn't worked very well. In the last few years, we've had about 50,000 deaths, about 10,000 people go missing, another 250,000 displaced. It's gotten ugly.
What's the history of cartels in Mexico?
Well,
the birth of cartels.
Yeah, years ago, what they were basically people who worked for the Colombians. The Colombians had the product, they would move it through. But a few Mexicans got the idea that, let's do more. Instead of just, being mules for the Colombians, let's make our own drugs, find our own drugs, or demand payment product. And then they became the big lords. And they were helped along by the DEA and other people who very efficiently went after the Colombian drug lords. Which
the
made
DEA in the States.
Yeah, they, through proxies in Colombia, have been very successful in prosecuting the drug lords in Colombia. I mean, we all know that Pablo Escobar was killed, and rather famously. But and so the Mexicans have taken their place, and they've been very, very, very prolific, and they now do most of the trafficking of cocaine and heroin in North America and much of Western Europe even.
So the difference between Colombia in the 80s and 90s and today in Mexico is?
There are a lot of differences. The Colombians weren't very sophisticated when it came to keeping a low profile. They made stars out of themselves. They made it obvious who was who. The Mexicans have learned from that. And they have also been very successful in infiltrating law enforcement, politics, judiciary, and intimidating those same people.
Okay, infiltrating how?
Well,
judiciary? Mexican judiciary? U.S. judiciary?
Mexican.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to make that clear. In the levels of law enforcement in Mexico, you have some places where the entire police force has been jailed because of their connections with organized crime. More than half of the national police force, the federales, which is sort of like their RCMP, have been dismissed. 180,000 members of the military have deserted and gone to the cartels. I mean, that's 3 times the size of the Canadian military.
So the big question, and it's a question you address in Gangland, who's in charge, the government or the cartels?
In some places, the government dare not go. I mean, we all remember the armed insurrections earlier in places like Chiapas. A lot of these places that are heavily indigenous, don't even speak Spanish, parts of Mexico, have for years felt alienated by the government in Mexico City. And so much like how the mafia emerged in Sicily and Calabria, you have groups that are a shadow government, and they pay for health care, pay for education, and they also settle disputes. The way they fund this is through drug trafficking, and then that gets out of hand and they become a cartel.
And mostly heroin and cocaine, or meth and cannabis?
Marijuana as well. 90% of all meth. I mean, a lot of people think of meth as, the cookout in the woods, like Breaking Bad. That's largely been supplanted by the Mexicans. They have factories where they make thousands of tons of meth throughout Mexico and even the Western United States. They've infiltrated a number of national parks and forests, and they make the meth there, throw the waste product away, and protect it with AK-47s.
Well, that would keep me away. So it's clear that Nixon's war on drugs and Reagan's war on drugs, the war on drugs did not work, is not working. What will work in this case? What could work?
That's a hard question, because Canada's had essentially the same policy under another name, and President Obama has kept the same policies but retired the name.
Just say no.
Yeah. Mexico has legalized personal use for all kinds of drugs: heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine. but it hasn't really had any effect on trafficking or use. I mean, you will find places like California coming very close to legalizing marijuana and not wanting to be the trafficker to the rest of the country. There has to be a profound shift in how we look at drug use and drug distribution before any progress can be made.
And do you mean legalization? What?
Well, if legalization comes around, it has to, and I think it's inevitable in the long run. It might be 50 years from now, but certainly for marijuana. But it has to be across the board. I mean, if you have a product illegal somewhere and legal somewhere else, it's going to lead to more trafficking. And there's always something that's going to be illegal. I mean, there's a big market in Canada in marketing steroids, and they'll never be legal, or heroin, for example. There are lots of users, but legalizing it might not be the answer.
If you're desperate and poor and you live in Mexico and you're trying to get out of that, what's the lure of drug trafficking or a cartel? The lure and the fear is really what it is. If I do this, it's illegal, but if I do this, I may not just be eating frijoles.
That's true, and it's not just someone who's poor, it's pretty well everyone. In Juarez, there's a big poster, like a billboard, that advertises joining the police force. And beside it, the cartels put up their own billboard that said, we pay better, we'll give you a truck, we'll give you life insurance, why bother with those guys?
So they say, I'm illegal, and I'm a cartel, and you can join me because you'll make more dough?
And that's the way it is. There's a policy down there, they call it plata o plomo, which means silver or lead. It's first they'll offer you a bribe, and if you don't take it, then they'll kill you. I mean, you don't really have that many options.
Death or?
Death or take our money.
Take our money.
It's in your best interest.
So the Mexican thinking, the Mexican way of thinking, how different than in North America or in Canada?
See,
or is it?
It is very different, and that's one of the things we don't understand, is we know it's a little different, but we don't know what they've been through. In Mexican history, they've had at least 3 revolutions, 2 different emperors. They've been invaded by all kinds of different countries. But in sort of our, sense memory, they've had it very tough. For almost 100 years, they had the kind of, one-party kleptocracy that we associate with African nations. It was a really tough place to live. And now that it's modernizing and liberalizing and democratizing, they're going through a difficult period. And that's why a lot of these cartels can sell themselves as freedom fighters. Because a lot of people associate the government with something truly evil, and the alternative can appeal to them.
Well, somebody said a Mexican tells a lie because he delights in fantasy. Don't know if that's true. And not, branding all Mexican people, because there's some very cosmopolitan Mexicans, and they're not all drug dealers.
Oh, of course. I mean, this is a culturally rich country with 90 million people, but they're going through a crisis right now.
And you say in Gangland that not only are the drugs coming into Canada, the heroin and the cocaine, but the cartels are here.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the number of Mexicans coming to British Columbia in particular under refugee status claims has increased tenfold in the last couple of years. And there are people in law enforcement who allege that they are involved more in the drug trade than any legitimate refugee claim. And I've actually spoken to people who are advocates for Hispanic Canadians who really want a lid put on that because it endangers people who have legitimate claims.
Of course.
And they're attracted to BC because of the very potent marijuana, which is in demand in the U.S. And they're finding it easier to import to the U.S. over the lightly defended Canadian border than over the very much scrutinized Rio Grande.
Okay, so be part of the multi-billion-dollar industry somehow. Now you get up close and personal with some of these people, the rats or the bikers or the hells or all of that. How do you do that as a reporter?
It's hard. They come and seek me out now for the most part because I have sort of a reputation as someone who will tell the truth on their side and on the other side, try not to make a judgment. Obviously, I'm for law and order, but you have to put these things into perspective. A lot of the Mexicans, they will kill local journalists, but they will always let sort of a journalist from a westernized nation like Canada or the U.S. go because they think they're getting the message out that they're actually freedom fighters they're, having a revolution in Mexico and that they are fighting against an unjust government.
The politicians, the president perhaps, like Fox was president, now Calderon?
Calderon, yeah.
Calderon. Where's the corruption level at the high level?
Well, it's hard for me to, sort of point a finger at Calderon, but, previous presidents from the period when it was single-party rule, they've been indicted for all sorts of things, run off to Switzerland. One candidate for president was actually caught cheating at the Munich Marathon. There's a level of corruption there that's unbelievable to Canadians.
And what about laundering the money?
Well, that happens up here and in the United States as well. Wachovia, one of the big banks in the U.S., when I lived in the U.S., I had an account there. They were caught laundering tens of millions. There was talk of airplanes full of money crossing the border. And when they were absorbed by Bank of America, they had to take on those debts and all the penalties associated with it, and it helped fuel the credit crisis.
Okay, and in a cartel, the rules. Where do the women fit? Are there women? Where do the men fit? Where do the couples fit? Who gets killed? Who doesn't?
Well, that's one of
What's the pecking order?
Not very good. That's one of the biggest problems in Mexico right now is the treatment of women. And that's what I begin the book with. In Juarez, there have been over 2,000 women go missing, and they found the bodies of about 500 of them. The culture there is such that, particularly in northern Mexico, it's very macho. There has been a lot of employment from the maquiladora factories. Factories come from all over the world to set up in Mexico because of low labor costs and pretty lax enforcement of many different rules. But they like to employ only women because they consider them more reliable, less likely to cause trouble. But that has caused a friction between men and women in Mexico because in a macho culture, to have a woman make more money than you can be a grave insult. And there's been a surge of violence against women in Mexico that's just truly horrifying.
Truly. And murders of tourists, too, and all of that, and a nice little couple, supposedly, from Middle America, killed in their hotel room. Yeah, Middle Canada.
Yeah, the famous one were the Ioneros in 2006. There was a sort of well-to-do family from Woodbridge, Ontario, which is just outside of Toronto. And they went to Mexico for a wedding. And the ironic thing is that they were going to go to Jamaica, but they thought Mexico would be safer. And they were murdered, and because of the widespread belief that Italians have a lot of money at weddings, and the person who tried to rob them was a former military guy who was involved in a cartel, and now he's escaped into the U.S., and he's just another sort of nameless, undocumented illegal immigrant.
What do you want us to learn from this, mainly?
That Mexico is in a state of war right now, and that Canadians right now are visiting Mexico in record numbers because the Americans are generally a little better informed, and they're staying away in record numbers, which has brought prices down, and people are vacationing in Mexico. I'm not going to say that it's too dangerous to go to Mexico because the resorts are fairly safe, and Canadians are not generally targeted. But it's too easy to fall into a pattern where you help out the cartels, buying their drugs, looking away, and not understanding what's going on.
Nice to see you, as
nice
always.
To see you.
Thank you. Gangland, the rise of the Mexican drug cartels from El Paso to Vancouver. Jerry Langton.